that you will, in fact, consider the words from the book of Genesis and from 1 Corinthians that I have chosen for this topic. Hear the word of the Lord. This is about the sixth day of creation. God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." And God said, "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I've given every green plant for food." It was so. God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. There was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. The New Testament passage is from one of Paul's letters, where at the start of this letter he's trying to explain how his followers and how the followers of Jesus Christ should regard themselves. Are they disciples? Are they apostles? Are they all of those things? And Paul uses the word steward here. Think of us in this way, as servants of Christ and stewards of God's mysteries. Moreover, it is required of stewards that they be found trustworthy. And with me, it's a very small thing that I should be judged by you or any human court. I don't even judge myself. I'm not aware of anything against myself, but I am not thereby acquitted. It is the Lord who judges me. Therefore, do not pronounce judgment before the time, before the Lord comes, who will bring to light the things now hidden in darkness, and will disclose the purposes of the heart. Then each one will receive commendation from God. Amen. At this time, I also ask your participation in this prayer for illumination as we reflect on the Scriptures. Please join me. May your Holy Spirit give us the spirit of wisdom and revelation, so that with our hearts enlightened, we may know the hope to which Christ has called us, and the greatness of his power for those who believe. Amen. I understand through conversations with some of the people who invited me here, and by the way, thank you for having me come today. It's nice to see you again after being away for 15 or 16 months since I was here last year. But I understand that your congregation over the next few weeks is conducting its annual stewardship campaign, and I even saw the pledge cards in the narthex out there. I gather that you will end this, like most churches do, around Thanksgiving, which just seems to be the proper, appropriate time for a stewardship campaign. Well, I want this sermon today to be a part of your reflection on stewardship as a way of encouraging you to take a wider and year-round approach to stewardship. It's been my experience in about 40 years of ministry that most congregations will not have a truly successful autumn campaign unless their members already are approaching stewardship as a way of life rather than just one time of the year when they need money. We first have to be stewards of God, and only then will we be truly committed to giving our money to God through the church. Over this last summer, I read again a book by a Canadian theologian named Douglas John Hall. It was titled The Steward, A Biblical Symbol Come of Age. My intention today is to share insights from that book, so I'm afraid it's going to sound a little bit like a book report rather than a stirring sermon. The point is that I want to tie the insights from that book not only to this idea of an annual campaign, but also to another prominent issue, and that's how to care for the earth and our environment. The insights of this book arise from Scripture. He is a biblical scholar, among other things, and if we were to act on these ideas, I believe they would draw us profoundly closer to Jesus Christ. Consider this, therefore, a stewardship sermon. I am not, however, going to ask you for money so you can loosen the grip on your wallet and just loosen your mind to listen. The Bible contains 26 explicit references to the word steward, and at least that many passages which explain the characteristics of a steward. These references range from the very first verses of Genesis, which we read, through the prophets, into the gospel parallels of Jesus, and on into the letters of St. Paul. The first reading today immediately launches the theme. On the sixth day of creation, God creates humanity to act as a mediator and administrator between God's heavenly sovereignty and the creatures God made. We bear the image and likeness of God, but we are not God. We are God's ambassadors, God's representatives, who act with the authority of God to maintain and further the purposes of creation. In the first creation story, God grants us dominion over the earth. Now, as we'll see later, that word can be understood rightly or it can be misused. Later on in the Old Testament, and still in the book of Genesis, there is another example of a steward, and that is Joseph. After he had been released from prison and raised to a position of authority, he becomes the steward for Pharaoh. He manages the economics of the whole kingdom of Egypt. Joseph, in turn, has a steward of his own, who acts on his behalf in the dealings with his brothers when they come back. Moving on toward the end of the New Testament, the book of Daniel has an example of the king of Babylon placing 4 young Hebrew men in the care of his steward, giving that man both great power and great responsibility for their upbringing. On to the New Testament. The writers of the New Testament are able to look at the Greek and Roman culture around them, and they see an example of stewardship. Because in every relatively wealthy home, or even middle-class homes, there was usually a person called the steward, who could be a servant, maybe a slave, although I want you to remember that that word in Greek can mean either servant or slave. It's basically the same thing, although if the steward is a slave, it's one that probably has more freedom than we usually associate with that word. But the steward is, at best, second in command in the household. But the steward is in charge of the whole household economy. What food to buy, how to organize the other servants, how much money to set aside for a rainy day, when to have the new clothes ready for people as a new season approaches. But all of this is done on behalf of somebody else, somebody in a higher position of authority. None of those items belong to the stewards themselves. The decisions, the goods, the responsibilities are placed upon their shoulders. They are chosen for a special purpose. And they will be held accountable for how well they have in fact managed their master's resources or planted and harvested his crops when he returns. Jesus uses that model to tell parables all through his word about stewards who are kind of minding the farm, as it were, while the master is away. Those stewards have substantial respect and authority, but they better not fall asleep on the job. They better not mistreat the servants while the master is away, because they're going to have to stand front and center before the master to account for their actions. On into Paul's letters, St. Paul proclaims that any steward must be trustworthy, and that we are sufficiently important to God, that God has made us the steward of God's mysteries. So always, from start to finish, whenever the Bible portrays a steward, that person stands between two sides of a dynamic. The owner, the master, is the ultimate source of authority and the ultimate source of any material prosperity that the household has. As stewards of God, therefore, we have to remember the truth that what we seem to have control over does not belong to us. It is a gift placed in our hands. We are accountable to someone else. And if we misuse our delegated authority, there will be a price to pay. On the other hand, though, as stewards, we have a privileged and responsible position. We have recognized abilities for this job. God gives us substantial power to decide how to use things and elevates us to the status of his own ambassadors. We act on behalf of God, and that is in many respects the definition of who we are. It is a privilege, it is a gift, it is a responsibility. It is the way we are in relationship with God. Now look, there could have been other biblical words that would describe our relationship to God. There's the word disciple, there's the word apostle. But the fellow who wrote the book, Douglas Hall, believes that the term steward is one of those ideas whose time has come. He says it has come of age. One key reason for that relevance, he believes, is how pertinent this idea is to one very significant social issue of our time, and that is our relationship to nature, to the pollution of sea and sky and the emerging crisis of climate change. So I want to take just a minute or two to describe how he thinks the rediscovery of our role as steward can rescue us from mistaken attitudes toward the planet and its natural resources. It appears, alas, over the last few centuries that Western civilization has misinterpreted and misapplied the instructions that God gave us in Genesis to fill the earth and subdue it, or have dominion over it. Somehow it has creeped into our society that the predominant attitude toward nature is to view nature as resource, as little more than raw material for our industrial schemes and economic progress. We have interpreted dominion as if it meant to dominate and devour. We have thought that to subdue means to subjugate and squash. So from the rare earth minerals that power our cell phones and conduct electricity, to the fish in the sea that now are sufficiently depleted that we must farm them, that end up on our dinner table, we have in many ways exploited the earth and its creatures. And interestingly enough, people are beginning to talk about the limits on our future, that scarcity haunts our possibilities, like the scarcity of clean water that will evaporate faster as the planet warms. Now, this emerging ecological movement of the last 50 or 60 years or so has often pointed an accusatory finger at the theology that is displayed in those verses from Genesis. Environmentalists sometimes charge Christianity with justifying that rapacious relationship to natural resources. I don't think that's entirely accurate or fair. The real reasons for exploitation lie elsewhere. But there's just a hint of truth in that claim. And that's because we have forgotten our role as steward, as God's ambassador. And instead, we have allowed ourselves to slip into the belief that the human race owns the earth and can choose what it wants to do with it without consulting the master. Every good Christian steward knows that this earth has been granted to us as a gift and a responsibility by its creator. We do not own earth's resources. We are only their caretaker, their nurturer. So if we ruin the face of the earth with too many coal ash ponds or melting glaciers, then we will have forfeited the privilege that God granted us in those first verses of the Bible. Now look, there is another end of that spectrum, however, and that's kind of a growing naturalistic movement that claims that we should just leave nature alone and let it regulate itself, that nature provides for us adequate rules for living and sufficient bounty for nourishment without our interference. Let the cockroaches come. Now, as a corrective against the exploitation of nature with our modern technological tools, this argument to leave nature alone does make some sense. It has been good to watch the pollution levels in the air drop in the months of our stay-at-home orders during the pandemic because we're not driving as much. But as a permanent guide for the future, this naturalistic sentiment is dangerous and naive. There were, after all, hurricanes and earthquakes, plenty of them, long before climate change arrived. They were destructive and death-dealing events, and we had to learn how to adapt and how to tame them to a certain extent, to strengthen building codes along fault lines and shorelines. If we hadn't done that, we would have felt nature's fury even worse. And if science and medicine were not battling every day against a natural force called the coronavirus, then infection rates and deaths would have increased even more exponentially. And a half century ago, if a man named Norman Borlaug, who won the Peace Prize from Nobel, if he and others in the first Green Revolution had not developed hybrid wheat strains with shorter stalks and heavier, fuller heads, then it was predicted that the subcontinent of India 40 years ago would have suffered a famine that would have killed a quarter of its citizens. As stewards of God's creation, therefore, we know that nature needs to be guided toward its least destructive outcomes and corrected in its excesses, while also being treated with respect and caution and honor. St. Paul claimed that Christians were to be stewards of God's mysteries, and some of those mysteries are out there in nature, and we must protect them. For nature is a wonderful gift. We are also to remember that, like us, nature has fallen from what God originally intended. And God has appointed human representatives, stewards, to help redeem nature where it is broken. I took the title of my message today on being a steward from the last chapter of Paul's book. He doesn't end his work by cheering us on to go out and do some stewardship. He knows that stewardship isn't just an isolated act. It is an attitude. It's something that we are. It's a way of looking at the world. One of the slogans, one of the mottos that actually shaped my own philosophy of life goes like this: that the hand does not do strongly what the heart does not believe. You see, if we're just simply ordered out of our duty or guilt to do something we don't truly see the reason for or even really believe in, then yeah, we may accomplish that out of our sense of duty. But if we only obey God out of fear or duty, we will eventually end up resenting God and straying against the lawgiver and seek ways to avoid both the task and the taskmaster. Remember, that caution lies at the heart of the Protestant Reformation. It was that misguided relationship to God that prompted Luther to seek a better way. If in response then to divine forgiveness and hope and gratitude for all that God has given us, if that comes from knowing and believing in Jesus Christ, then we will apply ourselves with gratitude and freedom, and we will work twice as hard, and yet we will not feel the strain, because we have known grace, and we have known the bounty of a good God, and that gives us wings. And we will be able to accomplish with the grace of God twice as much as we tried and failed to accomplish on our own strength, out of a feeling that somehow we've got to accomplish this duty. Well, it's something like that dynamic, I think, that makes this author want us to be stewards rather than to just do stewardship. Because stewardship is a philosophy, it's a worldview, it's an attitude that you take into all of life, in which you regard God as a beneficent donor and this whole material world as a gift placed in our hands to manage. So let's not just do stewardship. Let's be stewards. And be the mediators between God and the world around us that God intended. And joyfully bear the responsibility that is placed on our shoulders, because we believe in the justice and gracious providence of the one that put it there. Then and only then, if we become stewards, do we have the right attitude to conduct a successful stewardship campaign.